Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. Welcome and thanks for logging on. It's a hot one today. We have mechanically nearly identical, dimensionally similar, thematically comparable, and qualitatively equal manual wind Lemania-powered chronographs from Vacheron Constantin and Patek Philippe versus starts now. Okay, so I've wanted to run this comparison for a really long time, but getting both of these watches in the same place at the same time is a rarity even by the standards of my business. I'm thrilled to present these two 42 millimeters in rose gold. You probably know the Patek Philippe 5070R better than you know the Vacheron Patrimony Traditionnelle 47192. So we're going to move the Patek out of the frame for a moment. It'll be back, and we're going to talk about the Vacheron first. Now, there was only a little bit of overlap in the production of these two models. This one debuted in 2009, and really 2009 was the swan song of the platinum version of the 5070. But because they are so similar, it's a natural comparison, and watches do last forever. This watch is 42 millimeters in diameter. It's 11.2 millimeters thick. From lug tip to lug tip, you can see it has really hard angular lug profiles with downward steps. 49.9 millimeters across the wrist, and then a 22 millimeter spacing in between the lugs. We'll zoom out a little bit here. I've got the baseboard that I use for my Instagram reviews. I just like the way it looks under the rose gold. So if you're wondering why we've got a different platform, we'll be back to the usual one pretty soon. On my wrist, it's a big watch, and you could see 16 centimeters circumference. We might be at the limit of what's possible here. Maybe 15 if your wrist is really oval and flat across the top, but it is a very svelte thing, and even a little bit thinner than the Patek. The quality of the watch that is eyes closed, the perceived weight, incredible. You don't feel like you're being shorted the gold on this watch, and that's a nice thing. Now, we do have a double fold clasp, which some people consider to be a little bit of an advantage. It's better for a small wrist because it's less likely to pinch you, and you can see you've got all sorts of Maltese cross motifs inside and out. Now, of course, Patrimony and Traditionnelle, they are now different lines, but back when this watch came out, Traditionnelle was a model within Patrimony. Now today, if you see these hands, Dauphine, you're looking at Traditionnelle. So that's what this would be by the 2024 standards of Vacheron model family nomenclature. The dial is beautiful. Now, it's primarily what Patek would call opaline, which is a frosted non-directional grain. You can see there is a small amount of brushed directional metallic finish and two different silvers on this dial. You've got the silver used for the center, the centers of the sub-registers, and then the outer track. And then you've got this more metallic and clearly metallic textured silver that's used on the sub-registers and then to a lesser degree on the track for the chronograph seconds and the minutes. Now, this watch doesn't make a show of trying to disguise the disparity between movement and case size, whereas Patek goes a little bit heavier in that direction. What we do have, though, is a concession to legibility, which I really appreciate. You can see that the Dauphines are half frosted, making this an easier watch to read at a glance. And whereas the Patek has a darker dial, almost gray, this is much more clearly silver white. On the back, Lemania 2320. I've often called this a 2310, but the 2320 is the more upscale version of that of Bausch, and that's what we have right here. Look very carefully, and you can actually see the Lemania LWO stamp on the base plate of the movement here. Now, a common misconception is that these are Geneva hallmark. They're actually not, these 47192s. They are of that standard materially, but for some reason, the Poinçon de Genève was never sought out. Now, you can see it is a lateral clutch column wheel chrono, and beautifully decorated. We have satin and beveling on the steel parts of the chrono, and then stripes and beveling on the brass bridges. Screw heads are black polished with chamfered slots in circumference, 48-hour power reserve, 2.5 hertz beat rate. You can see Vacheron upgrading things with an overcoil hairspring. Balance that's basically free sprung, but does have a swan's neck for fine timing adjustments. And a real rarity on a modern watch, that little golden wire there, that's called a hairspring guard, designed to prevent an overcoil from getting hung up on the regulator under conditions of shock. 21 joules and 5-position adjusted. Column wheel feel is excellent. A superb watch and a superb value. So these cost about $32,000 to $34,000 full box and papers today. Now, the Patek needs no introduction. The 5070 was launched as a yellow gold model in 1998, and then from 2004 to 2008 it was available in rose gold. according to Patek itself, it was about 250 watches per year per metal, so you can get the sense of how many were made total. It was about 1,000. Now, the watch, of course, is designed to echo the 1950s prototype split-second chronograph 2512. That was 46 millimeters, so while 42 seemed huge when the model debuted in the late 90s, it was almost a mid-size compared to the watch that inspired it. It's not as broad across the wrist as the Vacheron at 48.5 millimeters lug-to-lug. It's a little bit thicker at 11.6, and then it's got a slightly narrower lug spacing at 21, though again, 21 back in 1998 must have seemed incredibly broad. Today, it's pretty much standard, but back then, it would have been quite a stanced watch. You can also see some tricks are played to disguise the disparity between movement size and case size. We have this sort of flattened pagoda-like stepped bezel, and then we have these many concentric tracks on the dial, whereas on the Vacheron, you can see the bezel's fairly thin. It's only got one conical plane, and then while there are some tracks, including a tachymeter on the dial, they don't do much to disguise that disparity. We do notice that this is a small movement, whereas here, it's the kind of thing you notice when it's pointed out. It's better disguised. Also, you can really see the difference here. This is a little bit like Alubeam, the AMG color on high-performance Mercedes. It's not a white silver. This is like a white silver. This is more of a silver gray. Alubeam on an AMG, or maybe Avis silver on an Audi. Now we have vertically arrayed Arabic numerals here. We have leaf hands, lancet style for the chronograph seconds, and sunken sub-registers. You can see here the registers are actually sunken at their outer edge, but then raised at their center. And I would say that there's a lot more detail on this dial. I think more time was spent on this design, and particularly here, where from some angles you can lose the hands, you appreciate the half frosting of the Vacheron. Mechanically, they are almost identical, but Patek does make some changes. The Patek movement is more of a departure from the Lamagna base, and so instead of 48 hours of power reserve like the Lamagna, here we get 60. We get a free-sprung Gyromax style balance, and you can see here the balance really is quite large, and you can even visibly see that Patek's balance is a little bit bigger and has a little bit more inertia, and that's obvious to the eye. But still an overcoil hairspring. The difference here is adjusted in 6 positions rather than the Vacheron's 5. We have a capped column wheel, although I would say, despite the difference in the architectures, you can see that the chronograph bridge is a little bit different. The balance cock and regulator are different. The design of the column wheel, the design of the clutch, they are different. I don't necessarily think one has more beautiful architecture than the other, though I will say the Patek seems like it's just a little bit better finished. And that's not because it does have the Geneva hallmark, it's because of things like this, where you can see that there are 3 interior angles on the chronograph bridge, for example, and they're really, really sharp and well-defined, whereas on the Vacheron, they start to move in that direction, but you can see that the definition of the angles, particularly this one outboard, not quite as sharp and cleft as on the Patek. But I'll give you one last look at the 2 architectures. I think particularly where the chronograph bridge and the clutch are involved, Patek is just a little bit better on that front. Both the 30 meters water resistant, so which one do I like better? Well, let's talk about their advantages first. So with the Patek, you have an all-time great model, the legitimate successor to the 1463. You got to remember, the 1463 was out of production by the very beginning of the 70s, and this model didn't come about in yellow gold until 1998, so it was a long time in coming. And it ran from 1998 to 2009, briefly resurrected for the Saatchi Gallery exhibition in 2015. But this is considered to be one of the greatest Patek models of all time, and it's also not just an all-time great model, it comes from a stronger brand. Patek Philippe has never been adulterated by large-scale corporate group ownership. It's never been a closeout brand. It's never been a discount brand. It's certainly never been a brand that relies heavily on factory boutiques, which can rub some people the wrong way. That's more of a Richemont thing. And the Sterns have proved over the long haul that they care about the brand, even going so far as to do things like cutting off popular models before their time to prevent them from overshadowing the brand. So between this being an all-time great watch from an all-time great brand in good hands, family kept, I think there's an aura of honor and principle and enduring value about this watch that it has for all of those reasons. Also, rarity. Again, about 1,000 of these in the world, and I can just tell you colloquially, by experience, I see more of these come through my office and far fewer of these. And I would even go so far as to say I see more of these come through my office than I see of every version of the 5070. So rarity. And because I think the brand will always be stern-controlled and family-run, I believe that this has more long-term brand equity as well. So if you do wear your watch as a totem of status, it also has that consequence. One of these things projects accomplishment in a way the other does not, and that's the advantage of the Patek and the disadvantage of the Vacheron. Now, in terms of movement, I'm going to say that this is superior because Patek makes a lot of mechanical improvements. The free-sprung Gyromax balance, the larger size of the balance with eccentric variable inertia screws, the fact that it is a 60-hour power reserve rather than a 48, Geneva hallmark versus not, 6-position adjustment versus 5-position adjustment. I really think that this has advantages here. Also, this is a pure free-sprung balance, whereas this is sort of an adaptation of a mobile stud index. So in terms of elaboration from the core and mechanical advantages, Patek Philippe. Also going to say that if you want to buy one of these to keep, like a legacy item that'll stay in the family, this is the kind of thing that's like the family home. It's like the Rolls Royce that generation after generation gets driven by the royal family. And you do really take care of a Patek for the next generation. I'm not saying you're ever going to sell it. If you did, it would be probably a better investment long term, but as something that feels special enough to be an intergenerational heirloom, this really feels like the one you want. And, frankly, if you were keeping it as an investment, this would probably grab, hold, and accumulate value better than the Vacheron. Also, with platinum, all 3 golds, and some special editions made, you've got more versions of this watch from which to choose, whereas with the Vacheron, you've got white gold, rose gold, I think just silver dials, and maybe a few very small retailer editions, and a 2013 boutique exclusive in white and rose gold. There are simply more versions of the 5070 out there, and I would also say that this does a better job disguising the disparity of size between movement and case, whereas the Vacheron, it's a little bit more obvious. Now, what does the Vacheron do better? Well, remember, this thing right here in rose gold is $70,000 to $73,000 box and paper. This watch, which is almost the exact same thing, costs less than half that, $32,000 to $34,000. Now, value play, self-evident. That leaves money in the bank for service. It leaves money in the bank for more watches. Also, because it is mechanically and almost dimensionally identical, you can wear this watch knowing that you're taking no reduction in quality. Everything about this watch is still special. The watchmaker building this at Vacheron doesn't think about being part of a luxury group. The watchmaker building this watch takes pride in his work, the same as the Patek Philippe watchmaker, and that material similarity is going to strike the person who's value-minded and open-minded as a real selling point. Also, I'm going to say right here, better dial detail. You can see that these step-downs with metallic finishing and then the step-ups at center with concentric patterns, the greater complexity of the indices, which are actually faceted several times versus these simple polished numerals, the split frosted and polished Dauphine hands for better contrast, the blackened chronograph seconds hand versus the matted rose gold hand here. I think there's just more detail and better legibility on this dial, and I think more money was spent on this dial than on this dial, and the more you look, the more you realize that's almost certainly the case. I'm also going to say that in terms of doing things to the regulator area, maybe a free-sprung Gyromax style balance is more sophisticated, but it's not more interesting to look at. Whereas you look here and you see this beautiful polished and beveled swan's neck with tapered spring, and it's mirror finished on its top, and then we've also got this hooking guard, which is a wonderful throwback to the overcoil hairsprings of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's an old school chrono feature I've only seen on vintage Rolex Daytonas. So this is altogether a more attractive balance bridge than what you'll find on the Patek Philippe. It's also a thinner watch. It's only 0.4 of a millimeter, but it is a thinner watch than the Patek Philippe. And I'm also going to say that this watch has a distinct advantage if you've got a big wrist. So on my wrist, you can see we're sort of pushing to the limit of what's possible. But if you've got a big wrist, the Patek might even seem a little bit small. And part of that's down to just how fine and narrow the lugs are, but also the fact that the lugs are just shorter side to side. The Patek is a very different look, but it looks like it's all case with very little lug, whereas Vacheron, which is famous for handsome, striking, strong, distinctive, and memorable lug profiles, has given this an angularity, a lovely sharp break from the case, and then that that under tuck where it's got a step inboard. So I would say the lugs here are stronger and creates a more powerful wrist presence. So you might ask, which one of these two would I buy? Well, cost no object, that's fairly easy, the Patek Philippe. But if cost were an object, I have to concede that Vacheron has delivered 95% of the watch for 50% of the price pre-owned. Both of these are discontinued, but if you change things up a little bit, cost no object for me, it's the Patek. Cost is a factor, it's the Vacheron. But if you were to change up the comparison, I would pay any premium for the yellow gold with the black dial. So I think ultimately my choice is going to be the 5070. But you guys, let me know, what are your priorities and which do you prefer? Tell me in the description below. Time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on.